when you're bump steering the car, what you're trying to do is when the car travels, it gets narrower in the front end, being independent suspension. And all you're trying to accomplish is that the wheels stay pointed straight when it gets narrow. You don't want to be driving down a straightaway and hit a bump and all of a sudden this tire tows out and this one tows this way and the car's darting around. The heaviest tire leads, right? So being that most cars are 58 left, the left side tire is leading and the right side tire is dragging until you experience a bump or turn off into the corner and a weight transfers. Well, then all of a sudden the weight transfers onto the right front, that's aimed at the wall, so the car starts darting at the wall, so you turn to the left, and then the weight transfers back to the left, and then it shoots at the infield. So like if you have a car, like a big track, like a Jennerstown or wherever, with some straightaway or Milwaukee, where you feel like you're just always behind, like the car's driving all over the place down the straightaway, you probably have a bump steer issue, and that needs to be addressed. That's why it's darting around, is because the front end, you know, if it feels like it's coming out of the steering, right, you can tell if it's in the rear, like the motor's surging, like you're on a bump stop and it's biting and grabbing the right rear and letting go of it, or the left rear, for example. Especially on center pole cars, you'll see that if you have too stiff of bumps in them, it'll make the car dart around. But in the front end here, if it starts drifting around down a straightaway, you probably have a bump steer issue. The tires aren't staying pointed where you're aiming them. So right, you do all that work to make everything right, and then you turn in the corner and the right front tire's not aimed where you want it. But now if you go to a place, for example, like Dover's a good place there, or Bristol, places where you drop off into the hole and it gets real free in. Sometimes you'll bump the right front out on purpose, like 40, 60 thousandths, and it'll just, even though you're turning left off in the corner, it'll slow down how fast it's turning left, and you're steering off the right front tire anyway, and it'll give you some security turning in. It'll make it not have that, whoa, you know, that almost the elevator feel, like you're dropping down a floor and the car gets loose on you getting in. It'll take that out and just make the car secure so you can turn in. So it doesn't mean you always have to bump it a certain way. You know, there's situations where you're going to do something different. So anyway, just so people understand why we're bumping, what bump steer is even for. So I start out, got my car up on stands, I get a punch mark number. So what I mean by that is I get a measurement from the washer on top of the spindle up to a punch mark that I make on the bay bar here, right? So when the car is sitting on scales, race ready, right? So I'm on scales, race ready, everything's done except the bar's not set. I do everything before the bar's set. Driver weight, all fluids, everything. I get that number at the end of my setup, basically, before I'm ready to go up on stands and bump steer it. So then I can pull my springs off. I can put a jack underneath my spindle and jack it up, or I have my own gauge or my own pump I made up, my own ram I made up, so that I can pull the thing to what my punch mark is. That has my suspension located at ride height. Basically, right now it's the same as if I was sitting on scales. And then on mine, the way I have mine set up, I made a little digital gauge so I can watch real shock travel. I do all my bump to shock travel. So like I know pulled down, I got 3 inches of right front travel. So when I bump it, I make sure that my bump number is where I want it at 3 inches. As far as how I have my steering clamped, so I do all my setup with the wheels clamped straight forward. I mark my steering shaft. When I go to bump it, I unclamp it, and I'll turn it 1/8 of a turn to the left. You know, so if I grab the steering wheel at 12 o'clock, and I turn it about 1/8 of a turn, and then I reclamp it. I do that I used to do it a 1/4 turn, and then I was at the track one time doing a driver's car one time, and he's like, "Why do you turn it so far?" And I'm like, "Well, because that's where I've always done it, right?" And he's like, "Well, if I got to turn it that far, I'll be back in a lap and you can work on it." So I go 1/8 of a turn, because that's where most people feel like they're comfortable turning. So that's where the car is going to be when I race it. That's where I bump it at. So I put it at the 1/8 of a turn left, clamp it all, jack my right front up, like we're doing a right front right now, jack it up to my eye to eye, or to my install, set my gauges all to 0, and then I'm ready to start doing my bump. When I set up my my bump steer gauge, I always make sure that the little dial is set right at 5 o'clock, right, dead center on top, and that the other dial is 0. That way, if I got to make a bump adjustment as I'm doing it, I can keep resetting my toe, so that when I'm done bumping it, my toe's not way off. Like generally when I'm done bumping a car and I go to set my final toe, my toe is within a 1/16 or 1/8 of where I started, and it was set at 0 before I started bumping it, because I keep up with it. Every time I make a bump adjustment, I make a toe adjustment, and I keep it at 5 and 0 as I'm working. And when I'm all said and done, my right side is where it was before I started moving the tie rod up and down. So that's the prelim, you know, what we're doing here. Now I'll start going through it all and I'll show you kind of the whole process. I've got the sway bar arm off on the left side so it doesn't bind up, and I'm ready to go. So we'll make our first pass. I don't even worry about all the other gauges until I'm happy with the bump. Then I'll turn everything on, zero it out. These other gauges probably aren't necessary for everybody. I keep track of all this information so that if we're going to model something or make a sim program, I've got a year's worth, 2 years worth of data we can look back on, you know, and you can cross-reference stuff. Most people just need their bump gauge. I keep track of my camber and my caster gain loss, just so I have it for reference to look back on. So I'm watching how far I'm traveling. I know my right front got 3 inches, and I'm looking at my bump to see how fast, where the needle's going. Right now, right now I'm bumping in. I bumped in 100 thousandths in an inch. So I know that's way too much. So then I'd go back down to my 0, make sure I'm at my 0 and my 5 on my gauge, go underneath the car, and I'll make a bump I'll adjust my bump. So it's bumping in too much, I would slide the inner point up, and I look in there, I can see it's bottomed out, so I have plenty of room to come up. So we'll make that adjustment. All right, so I made my adjustment here. Got my gauge back to 0 to my install height. Now I'll look at this gauge, I'll get it back to 0, adjust my tie rod so that I'm at 0 and 5. So now my bump's been adjusted, my toe is fixed. Now we'll make another sweep, see where we're at. We were bumping in 100 in an inch. I went a little bit too far. Right now that's 10 thousandths out in an inch. I want to be on the right front. I typically, in my full travel, will bump it out or bump it in about 15 thou in on the right and 15 thou out on the left at full travel, so that basically right before that I'm at 0. And when the car experiences max load in the front end, which is usually on the brakes turning in, the front tires both just turn left a little bit. Everybody seems to like the feel of that. Haven't had no complaints about the car feeling darty or wandering down a straightaway. And it just adds a little bit of extra steer to the car without the driver having to steer the car. Gives them that security that it's driving in and turning into the bottom good for them. So, like I said, I went a little too far, so I'll have to come back on that adjustment just a fuzz. So I'll get her back to my 0, and I'll go underneath and I'll make an adjustment. So we'll make our next sweep here and see where we're at. We made our adjustment. We reset our toes so that we're 0 again. We're almost there. So now we're 1.5 inches of travel. We're at 0. So I want to be in, so I gotta adjust. I over adjusted on my first adjustment. I gotta come back a little more. So also something to know is, so the inner point is your course adjustment. Moving that a 1/16 is a big swing. The outer point is your fine tune. So once you're really close to where you're at, if you want to tune it, you can just shim the outer up or down versus shimming the inner. But if you got to go a long ways, you're never going to get, you're going to be inches in the outer versus 1/8 or 1/4 inch in the inner. So usually I get my stuff really close using the inner, and then if I want to tweak it, I'll mess with the outer. But just so you know that you're not going to get it all with spacer on the outer. If you're way off, start with the inner point if you can. All right, so this is our 3rd attempt. 45 in roughly at 3 inches, which is a little bit too much. I went a little too far, so here's where you could work on your outer point. I'm going to go to the inner and make one more adjustment. We should be right there. Now we're splitting hairs. We're talking about moving that inner point up and down thousandths to make the difference. It isn't going to take much. Or the outer you can move, but I want to keep the outer as far away from tie rod as I can. So instead of spacing it, or keep the outer as far away from the tire sidewall as I can for where this car is going. So I'll do it with the inner. So I'll have to, right now it's bumping in too much, so I'll have to flatten it out. I'll have to raise the inner point up, you know, a hair, literally. All right, so we made our adjustment. We got our zero there, got our back to our ride height, our install height, and zeroed our tie rod, so our toe is still right with our bump adjustment. See where we're at. So we're 25 in there. 15 to 25 is kind of the number I shoot for. 15 to 20, 15, 25, something in that range. So from there, I'm happy with that number. I'm going to lower it down. I'm going to make a small adjustment on the outer just to show you what, put in an 1/8 inch. You know, I was moving the inner thousandths at a time. Now I'm going to move the outer like an 1/8 inch and show you the difference of what that does for how much it actually moves the needle. And then we'll make one more sweep, and then we'll document notes. All right, so I put a 30 thou shim out underneath on the spindle side, just because I only needed a little bit, just to fine tune. So we'll show you what that is. That got us there, so I've already run it once, so I know it's right. So I'll write my numbers down, I'll turn everything on and do that at the same time. Again, like I said, most people don't need to document all the extra stuff. They just need to make sure the bump steer's right. I keep track of it just for reference for down the road if we build a sim program or anything. So I watch my travel gauge. I get my first number at a 1/2 inch because I really don't care about a first 1/4 inch of travel. I really don't care about the first inch. I mean, that's coming, you're down below that by the time you get on pit road out of your stall. So. But I started a 1/2 inch, and then I go every 1/4 inch through travel and record what my bump is, caster and camber gain. So I'm 19. So I'm 30 in at 1 1/4 inch of travel. .33 in, 1.5 inches. .34, 1 3/4 inches. Hanging there at 34 in, 2 inches of travel. Starting to bump back out, but I'm still in, but I'm 32 in right now. $28, 2.5 inches of travel. $24, 2 3/4 travel. Three inches of travel. I'm 18 in. I can live with that. I shoot for 50, somewhere between 15 and 25, so I can live with 18. I've gained 6.6 degrees of camber, and I have lost gained one degree of caster through travel. So anyway, that's basically all there is to it. Like I said, your inner point is your course adjustment. Once you start getting close and you just need a little bit, like I needed 10 or so thou, I put a 30 thou shim in the outer, and that got me there. I tried an 1/8 inch shim, a 200 thou shim actually, and that took me all the way back to 0. That moved at 40 thousandths, so that was way too much. But if I had moved the inner, that it'd have been hundreds of thousandths. So like I said, using your inner, moving the outer point as your fine tune, moving the inner point as your course adjustment, on to the next side. But I do both sides the same process. Try to keep my toe all the time, all the way through, so when I'm done, when I go to check my toe, it isn't like I bump the car and now, and I check the toe and it's towed out an inch, and like, is your bump even close? Because when you shorten a tie rod that much, that changes that whole arc. So I try to maintain both all the way through. That way when I'm done, ideally usually I'm turning my left side tie rod. When I'm all done, my right side is in line with my frame rail, because I set it with lasers earlier when I set up my car. So my right sides are still in line. I do my final toe with my left front. If I'm gonna tow it out or tow it in or whatever I'm gonna do, I do it on the left front. And then, so usually when I go to set that, I usually gotta spin my tie rod maybe a half a turn to get my toe right. Like, it's usually pretty close if you stay up with it like this. So, I don't know, that's how I recommend doing it. I just think that's the most accurate.